Hi, this is Jack Downs, the lecture on big concepts for the date Friday, February 7th, 2020, for web design and production, JOU317. And you are listening to this either because our class was canceled because of the weather, or maybe it wasn't canceled, but you couldn't make it because of the weather. So this is a video version of that class, which is really going to be just lecture-based. So I'm afraid there's no software required except for watching this. And let's look at Moodle and say that you will be hopefully seeing this on Friday. And the topic is big concepts. What was due today, you're supposed to be working on your cover letter 2. That means taking your cover letter, putting it into the format of the from the Black Goose exercise with a different image in a folder and zipping it. I did tell you I was going to show you about how to zip that. I'll try to remember to do that at the end of this video also. Or if you're in class and you see it, that's fine too. Or maybe you already know about zipping, but make sure you zip the root folder, not the project folder, the folder that just has in it one HTML document and one image. That should all be all that's in there. Okay, and I'm asking for next class that you finish cover letter 2 and that you submit it. That is due next class. And then you read chapter 5. We're really going to be getting into HTML now. That's what chapter 5 is. And to tell you or to warn you or caution you that there is a quiz on Wednesday on this lecture. I'm going to ask you the HTML basics again. In other words, the minimum structure of a document. And I'm asking you about the file naming. I'll give you some file names that have problems, file and folder names, ask you to fix them. Troubleshooting in general, you may be asked to do more troubleshooting, and you may use an index card. I will remind you of all this on Monday. So let's go ahead for the lecture. The topic of the lecture, this sort of parallels your chapter 3 with some of my own stuff in it. Helps to focus that a little bit more. Some big concepts about HTML and CSS. And these are some of the concepts that we will discuss. What is the web? Used to be this was the web, the desktop machine, not so much anymore. Now the web appears on lots of devices and many more than these kind of devices. And the big difference, of course, is different widths, but it's also different operating systems and different browsers. In the future, what will the web be? Who knows? It could be browsers everywhere, web documents being interpreted in many different places and ways. So we have to be prepared for that. And we'll get to it in a minute. But one of the best ways to be prepared is to stick with the standards. And the difference between making sure that distinction between HTML and the structure is distinct from CSS, which is the presentation. So we could talk about two theories of web design. Historically, there were. And if you could imagine there was a war between these two theories, one of them has won. Kind of. But it's still interesting to look back and see what it was. And these ideas still kind of persist. The two theories would be, one was that we have a single website responsive to different screen sizes and speeds. This is called responsive web design. Okay, good. That idea is predominant now. If you go to a website and you view it on a big, beautiful desktop monitor or on a phone, maybe at a slower speed, it's the same website giving you the same stuff. Then there is the idea, on the other hand, the opposing idea, was that we should have built sites specifically for larger screens with faster connections, desktop sites, and then separate sites, actually a different URL even, for small screens with slower connections. These were called dedicated mobile sites. And that's what we used to have. It used to be most major websites were actually two different websites. One you looked at for mobile. You may have actually intentionally gone there, or maybe it just detected your device and sent you to a different URL. URL changed slightly. We call these M.dot sites or mobile sites. They often have the M or mobile in the name of them, in the URL, I mean. You can read more about these ideas at these two websites. Let's go take a look at the first one. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them. This just talks about the principles of responsive web design. And it also tries to make a distinction between responsive and adapted web design, although it doesn't make that very clearly. The next link does. It frankly is not that important a distinction. They both adjust to screen width. A single website adjusts to screen width. They do it in slightly different ways. Either one adjusts constantly the whole time. One adjusts to screen sizes up to a certain point, and then it changes again, and it changes again at breakpoints. The big difference is the flow. The difference between between responsive sites and static sites is when they flow, when they get narrower, the copy will flow down in responsive sites, and static sites, it kind of gets stuck there. To do this, we might use relative units like percentages as opposed to static units. Pixels are the static unit of web design, and we will use pixels for some things, but in general, we don't use them very much anymore because they are a hard size that won't flex. Breakpoints. We might find that with breakpoints, at certain widths, all of a sudden the site changes. It doesn't just get smaller. It actually adjusts to a whole different layout. Maybe things disappear. Maybe things rearrange. We might have minimum and maximum width values. That's how we deal with changes in widths also. Because just because something gets really wide doesn't mean we want the content to necessarily get completely wide. Maybe it gets too wide when it stays super wide. Maybe we want to set some limits on it. It can only get so small. It can only get so big. We might have objects nested in other objects. Yeah, more about that later some other time. And this is kind of an important distinction, not one for us in class, but the idea is, was your site first designed for mobile and then scaled up for the desktop? Or was it the other way around? And this gets into more details. We will talk about web fonts. We will talk about bitmap versus vector images. You can read about those. This is actually a very thorough and good website. Except for the idea of adaptive and responsive, and that there's a distinction between them. And I got to go to the next. There we go. But I could also go to this other website I show you, and this talks about the difference between responsive and adaptive design. I'm not going to go into detail, but if you want to know more about it, go read this. Go read about it here. And it's a very interesting website page, which has got some good stuff on it. Okay, so those are the two theories. The first of the theories, responsive web design. The pros were we have one website. Everybody gets the same stuff. We don't have to update things in two different places. We have one URL. It's less confusing. It's easier to market. It's just one place to get the stuff. The cons were, even with a lot of work, your site is not necessarily absolutely great for both really big and really very small screens. It takes a lot of work to make it really good for that. In general, you started as the desktop, right, image heavy and big, and then you try to scale it down, but it wasn't scaled down that well, and it might be slower performance for mobile, and it might be harder to navigate. It might take more work to customize for each type of device. So those were those problems, pros and cons of responsive web design. Examples of responsive web design, go to any website really. Make it really narrow, make it really big. Let's go to, this suggests Starbucks, so let's go to Starbucks, shall we? Not Starbucks near me, but just Starbucks. Ooh, that's a big cup of coffee and another one on this big desktop site. But what happens if it gets really narrow? And even narrower and narrower and narrower? It adjusts, things move around, things get squished, but they don't just get squished, proportionally, they actually change to a different image or a different version of the image because they become vertical now. So not just proportionally smaller, everything's being rearranged. Some photos have disappeared, some have gotten, so on. So that's the idea of responsive web design, which is the web that we know today. But a dedicated mobile idea, the pro was that there was, even today, mobile browsers, there's a lot more of them in different kinds of devices, and it's there to adjust to them and change, and they change more quickly. There's more versions of them out all the time, right? So if we had a separate site just for mobile, it was easier for us to use that to keep up with all those changes. It was probably faster to load and easier to navigate on mobile also. The con was, of course, that it was multiple URLs, and it was confusing. And it was redirecting to which site you were supposed to go to could actually slow things down. And because you had two different chunks of content, you had one whole chunk of HTML in one place, another chunk of HTML in another place, well then, when something changed, when a price of a product changed, for instance, you had to make sure you changed it properly in both places. It wasn't just one set of content. The other con here, I'll just mention briefly, is that Google didn't like it. Google was behind the push to responsive web design and away from dedicated mobile. And they started to penalize dedicated mobile sites. And they ruled essentially that we are going to promote responsive web design, and of course then everybody had to go that way too. And that's how we ended up where we are. But if you want to see what they used to look like, it looks kind of like an app, doesn't it? Well, on a phone, the .m or m dot site from Walmart would appear like this. It was just a completely different site. But it wasn't an app, it was still a website. In some ways, you could say that the m dot sites should have now disappeared. And here's, if you want to read more about them and what happened to them and so on, here's some articles you can read. I'm not going to spend time with them right now, and that won't be on the test, but maybe you are interested in it. You could say that the m dot sites have really, in some ways, become apps now, which is a separate piece of software that functions differently. It may have something like HTML and CSS in it, but it is just on your phone and not in a browser. Okay, so is there another alternative? Well, before there was responsive web design, and before there were m dot sites, and still some places, there are what we would call static sites. And in fact, this class is only really created so that you can really learn how to make static sites, which is how we start. And actually, you're going to learn quite a bit about making responsive sites also, although the class wasn't necessarily designed for that. If you're going to learn more advanced web design, you would definitely learn more and more about making things responsive. But we first learned static, the idea of how to make the website, how it looks right at a certain size, and then you would learn how to adjust it. Static sites are simple HTML and CSS without a database behind them. Okay, good. And they also aren't going to have any responsive web design. They don't flex. They're built in hard units. They stay the same width. And here's how you can tell that a site is. And it's a little hard. There aren't that many around. I mean, actually, there are thousands and thousands around still. But you don't run into every day, and not for major companies and so on that would stay up to date. But here's a toy company, a toy store from the United Kingdom. And yeah, it's a bit of a goofy looking website and it's a little old fashioned, but for a toy store, it might be very appropriate, right? They were established in 2004. That's probably when this website was made. But there's nothing wrong with it until I try to view it on a small device or make it small, essentially, right? What happens? I get the dreaded horizontal scroll bar. See that? The dreaded horizontal scroll bar. It doesn't flex it doesn't make any attempt at flexing, actually, to a different width. It is stuck at that width. That is a truly static site. It's stuck at that width. Okay, we'll kind of move away from that idea. It's sort of an idea. So what if it isn't the idea of being responsive to different widths? What if we have browsers that have different capabilities? So are you worried that this really new, neat CSS trick you want to use isn't going to be viewed on some older browsers? Well, that's probably true. It won't work on older browsers, but you really want to use it. But what happens if somebody shows up with an older browser? Well, this is the idea of progressive enhancement, how we deal with browsers of unknown capabilities. Internet Explorer is notorious for taking a very long time to pick up on the new technology and the new CSS offerings, and actually for having lots of other bugs too. So we start with the baseline experience of what will work on all browsers pretty much, old browsers in particular. We write that into our CSS. It's usually CSS is the issue, not HTML. Then we layer on top of it other styles and scripts and other advanced features for newer, better browsers. And then we finish with the things that are brand new and would be nice to have, like animation or so on, but aren't critical to what you want the people to see. Now, this would be hard to see that this was happening because you get what your browser shows you. But what your browser shows you may not be everything that's offered, depending on how old or out of date or what type of browser you have. And if we use progressive enhancement properly, then that's okay. It means that we've shown everyone has gotten an experience, everyone's gotten the information, and maybe some people have gotten the full experience that we expect, but other people don't feel left out. So progressive enhancement is about. And this is about accessibility in browsers. Accessibility in a lot of different ways is a major issue that we deal with in websites today. Accessibility and speed, two key factors underlying this discussion. We want to make sure our pages are accessible to the most number of people despite different browsers or abilities. To do this, we stick with the standards and test in a variety of browsers. The other thing about speed is that when a browser is when a web experience is slow, even slightly slow, we know from research that people tend to click away and say, oh, I'm going to do something else. So it makes it hard and not very accessible for people. More in a minute. Sorry, I had to pause there for a moment. Okay, so another issue with accessibility isn't just the abilities of the browsers, it might be abilities of the people, right? So how do visually impaired people use the web? Well, they might use a screen reader. They might use software that reads the website to them. And it probably would be separate standalone software. They could use different big magnifying screens and other things too, of course. But visual impairment is one of the big groups that we have to think about when we're designing websites, as far as people with disabilities. But other thing we might use is we might use a an extension like a screen reader. I'll just show you this briefly. I am not very good at using this. I'm going to add this Chrome Vox extension to this my browser. It says, want to add it? I'll add it. Go ahead. And it's going to take a moment for it to come up. It's checking. And it has added the extension. I see it here.
Generic container.
Okay, good. So it will read to me. I'll turn this up a little bit. For instance, it will read.
Heading 1.
It's reading the HTML underneath here.
Overview.
Yep.
Heading. Chrome Vox. Giving voice to Chrome. You will need to disable your desktop screen reader when using Chrome.
I'll turn that down again now. It would get annoying if I continued, and there'd be a lot of shortcuts I'd have. It would allow to move me around the page and have it read to me. But I'm not going to do it right now because it makes my browser really weird. So I'm going to remove it. But that's an idea of a screen reader. It will read the screen. And there are many others. So if we need to have really good HTML underneath there because that's what it's reading. If we had screwed up HTML under there, poor structure, then it would have trouble making it through the page. More about accessibility and this accessibility standards. The Worldwide Web Consortium, W3.org, is a good place to learn about the standards. It's kind of like the committee that oversees the internet. It's a cooperative group. They're actually coming up with all the new standards for CSS and so on. They are like the International Web Governing Committee, the W3C. And they have a demo about the overview about how other things about design that may influence accessibility. And you would see, if you went through this demo, and I'll leave that link there, I may look at it a little bit. The home page before a redesign, is it going to come up? It has some problems like the type that's used and the contrast between the type and the background makes it hard to read, kinds of logos that are used, the way the images are used and probably don't have alt text with them. That's important for accessibility or so on, right? That's inaccessible, but then we go to the accessible version. It doesn't look like it's changed much. If you look at underneath it, though, the text has become much clearer and easier to read. The images now have alt text. The type of logos are used are proper type of logos, and so on. So you can learn more about the difference between the things you need to do to make sure your website is accessible. And if you happen to work for a government-related website, like SUNY Plattsburgh, for instance, if you were working on their website, everything you do would be looked at through that view of accessibility because the law requires that government-related websites focus on accessibility. And while we're talking about the W3s, we should probably mention the W3 schools. W3 Schools is the educational wing of the W3C. And it's a fantastic resource. I encourage you to consider using it. The nice thing, you can find lots of HTML and CSS and other, as you see, there's actually lots of different scripting and different things to learn here. You can find lots of information online, but you're never always sure that it's really the best, that it really sticks to the standards, that it's really up to date. But at least with this website, you can be sure of that. And they give you you can work through lessons. It isn't like a complete tutorial. You're going to need a class or something else too. But it's a good place to find other examples that might help you as you go through lots of different things here in HTML and CSS. Okay, and speed. With mobile, site performance is once more important than ever. For a while, we've gotten pretty fast with all of our desktop sites and our broadband connections, but then mobile came along and became predominant, and then a lot of connections weren't so good. Now, in general, they're probably a little better, but there's still an issue with mobile. Sometimes, some places, some devices. So, your text describes a Google study that showed only very slight slowdowns change the user behavior. In other words, they click away. So to stay fast, what should we do? Optimize the images. Make them as small as possible. They're still going to look good, but they shouldn't be any bigger than necessary. Be cautious with scripts. In other words, avoid scripts you don't really need. Remember, every call to the server is going to, and a script is one, is going to slow things down. And the script then has to run. It's like software that has to run, and it may slow things down further. Don't load unnecessary assets. If you don't really need that image, don't load it. Don't use it. Reduce the number of browser requests to the server. In general, images, scripts, links to videos, links to other subpages, so on. Well, not just the HTML link, those are safe, but other things that involve actually contacting the server for more information. Each of those slow down the loading of the website. So another big concept is search engine optimization. And you could take an entire class in this. And maybe you will someday. There's a lot to learn. It's a giant field, constantly changing. It means getting your page results higher in a list of search engine results, which of course means Google, right? So SEO is not really a big consideration for your resume site and for class sites. But if you're building a website for an online magazine or for some business or something, then getting up high in those search results is going to be really important. To optimize your site, first you have to figure out what keywords are necessary to bring your users to your site. So the way many people will begin in just a very original theory idea of a new website is just coming up with big, long lists of keywords. Imagine every keyword that someone could use to search for this site. Okay, and we're going to try to use those keywords and rank them and go through them and brainstorm over them to come up with the best ones. So we keep those keywords in mind whenever we create, for instance, the URL. In particular, getting the domain name. The domain name we get, which is this part of the URL right here, right? newbluegrass.com or newblue.com, right? That domain name. The domain name you buy, we'll learn more about how you buy a domain name, where you get them, and so on later. And the subpage URL, the path, the absolute path to the document, which you create with your file and your folder, your directory folder structure. The naming of all those things is critical. And you're going to use your keywords in all those as much as possible. Of those, getting the right domain name is perhaps the most critical, which isn't necessarily easy because there's a lot of them have been used already. But if we look at this example, we should be able to look at these words and have a feeling for what they mean in the sense that they go together to describe something and they would be searchable. So New Bluegrass, as in bluegrass music, makes sense if it's a site about bluegrass music. Artist, that makes sense. Gibson Brothers is a group, and that's the document name. But New Blue could be all kinds of things. I don't know what it is. And that is not make any sense at all. Many sites have these more randomly generated document names, which are garbage, really. So SEO, choose getting the right domain name, and then the right directory structure, naming things properly makes a big difference. Someplace else that SEO is extremely important is the title. You've already put a title on pages. The title is the description of the page. It appears within the head element, right? It does not appear in the body of the browser, but it does appear on the browser tab. In other words, these tabs up here, right? That is going to be where the title appears, and it's going to appear in the search results for Google, for instance. The results you get back, the title is going to appear there. Title text, so whenever we're creating title text, we're thinking of the keywords. They can push your page higher in search engine results. Title text sometimes is what the search engines display. So we tend to go from specific to general, for instance, or the other way around. But we would like to have both those ideas. So we might have the overall name of the brand or site name, and we probably would have a keyword in the title, which would be like, what is this page really? This is the employment page. So it'd be employment / and your name in the case of your resume. So some combination of those things. Headings. You've already seen headings, H1, H2, and so on. In that order, starting with the H1, which is the most important, the words in headings get picked up by search engines in particular. So you got to make sure that you have keywords in them, the keywords that you think will be important to that page and so on, and important in search results. So the text in headings is given higher ranking than other text on the page. To a lesser extent, this applies to other headings on the page, but H1 is the most important. And that's why we always want to have an H1. Occasionally, I see pages without one because they've used some kind of an image instead of the H1, but the H1 should still be there even if we don't display it. In fact, all the block elements, repeating keywords in them is important. But you can all of a sudden imagine you could create a site which was nothing but keywords and wouldn't have any good information. That would be going way too far. You've got to have more than just keywords. Okay, something else. You could keep those keywords in mind when you create links. We'll be creating links soon, so the text in the link should make sense, right? In other words, I mean the text here, the visibly displayed text. This is the URL we're going to go to. This is a visibly displayed text. 2013 Bluegrass Festival. So I really describe what it is we're going to be going to, and that will get picked up in the search engine results, or help to push our results higher. But just saying click here doesn't help at all. That's a waste of space. We really describe where we're going, both because it helps the user, but also because it is better for SEO. Search engines give links special attention. This applies also to internal links, like, for instance, links for navigation inside your site. Using good words there makes a difference too. And the internal link structure in general is important, and if you want to learn more about it, you can go to that link there. It won't be on the quiz, but alt text. Remember, we say that images require alt text. Sure, the image will display without them, but the reason we say it's required is because it is great for accessibility, but it's also good for SEO. In other words, if someone has the images turned off in their browser, or maybe they can't see images because they have poor vision, well, the alt text will be read to them. It would be seen with a screen reader, for instance. It also is seen as a text that may appear if the image doesn't. Maybe the image becomes missing, or maybe someone has images turned off. So alt text is important for SEO and for accessibility. And we think the alt text, in the case of this IMG, for instance, should be really descriptive. The Gibson brothers perform at the whatever, whatever, whatever. So it should really explain the photo. It's different if it's just a little logo or something, but it still should have some text, alt text with it. Keep keywords in mind when you create meta tags. You've already used a meta care set. There are other meta tags, and you can read about them in your textbook. Meta name description, as example, meta keywords, name keywords. So, frankly, these were abused in the past. There's a limited number of characters allowed for these, and people put things in them that didn't even apply to their pages just because at one time Google really used these to help decide what search results were going to be displayed where. Frankly, we're told now that Google largely ignores them, but it doesn't mean you shouldn't still use them. We're not going to use them much in class, not these other metas, but metas are information about the page, and you can put more words that might be picked up by a search engine, although it's uncertain how useful they are now, but they still could be used. And one of the best ways to improve your search results is one of the hardest things to actually do, is to have other trusted sites link to you. So if you get popular, trusted, well-known websites, ones that Google thinks are valid and useful, if you can get them to link to you by maybe exchanging content, exchanging links, getting in contact with the people who create those websites, maybe offering some kind of back and forth with them. If you get links of your site on those pages so they come to you, all of a sudden your results will start to improve. Okay, that is the end of the presentation, and I said I would take just a minute to show you about how to zip a folder, and I'll do that in just a moment. Okay, here's how we zip something. So it's important that you keep organized, only have the files, but you do have the files that are required, but only the files that are required in your root folder. So this is my project folder for my cover letter. This is your cover letter 2 assignment. Actually, this is not mine. This is actually Gina's. That's her last name. That's what she called hers. So that would be the project folder, right? And I like a project folder because it gives us a big place to put the things that are on the website and the things related to it. But I don't know whether you have one, and I should never see it. Because all I care about is this root folder. The root folder probably has your name in it, and all that's in there is the website. In this case, the website is just 2 files. The website is your image and your HTML document. Just to remind you, it looks like that sort of, and when you run it, it kind of looks like that, except different because it's your content and stuff like that. Okay, good. So what's this zipping thing? Well, the reason that we zip is I don't want you to just send me this document or just send me this document. I need you to send them to me in a relationship together. So I need you to send me the folder. You can't just put that folder onto Moodle. So this folder has to be turned into a single file. We do that with a right-click, send to compressed zipped folder. There are other ways to zip and other software you can use. Don't need it. Don't need to do that. Just a right-click. Now there's a similar operation on a Mac, but I don't have a Mac to show you. But if you do something similar on a Mac. And then when you do that, click on that, it creates a new file. It actually highlights it as if you want to change the name. And you could change the name, but if you name this one properly, you shouldn't have to. You can just click off. Now the icon will be different for that file. This one has a little Z on it. They may be different in other ways. They don't always look the same, but they're different. And it's its own single file. It can be moved and put up on Moodle as a single file. Last thing to remember about zip files, though, is that once you zip something, it's not going to act properly. So I can't go in. I can go in here. I can go in there and look in there, but I can't edit the stuff in there, and I can't run the stuff in there. It's not going to work properly. So once if you get it right to begin with, then you zip it and you submit it on Moodle. And then when I unzip it, it's going to be fine. How do you unzip something? I would just go into it. I like to open with Windows Explorer, and I would go in and grab the thing. I would copy it, and I would go paste it outside of the zip folder. I won't do that right now. I don't really need to, but that's the idea. We have to get the things out of the zip folder in order to edit them, look at them, have them work properly. Hope that helps. Thanks.